A few months ago, I made a very brief review of Spider-Man Miles Morales, a game that at the time of its release back in 2020 really disappointed me. But then, last week, I watched George, aka Long-Eared Fox's hour-long dissection of the game, and it gave me a newfound appreciation for what Miles Morales' story did, a story that at first I saw as predictable and generic. So, I looked back at my stream of the game, how I reacted to it, and something became abundantly clear to me. All those months back, when I called Miles Morales mediocre, it was because I'd fallen victim to hype culture. What is hype culture exactly? Well, you only need to look at the thousands of reaction videos, prediction videos, and speculation videos that cover this website. Whether it be games, movies, or TV shows, people love to build up excitement and expectations in preparation of a new release. This culture, of course, can be used as a force of good. It can provide entertainment, hell, it can even build whole communities. But as we all know, too much of a good thing never ends well, and the same goes for hype culture, which can easily grow from a flourishing community into a toxic mess of inflated expectations. I expected Miles Morales to be to Spider-Man PS4 what Uncharted 2 was to Drake's Fortune, what Arkham City was to Arkham Asylum. I expected this game to build hugely on the foundation Spider-Man PS4 laid for it. I expected Miles Morales to be the best superhero game of all time. So as soon as I realized it wasn't, as soon as I realized my expectations weren't reached, I immediately wrote off the game. I didn't appreciate it for what it was, I wasn't taking in the game, I simply spent 10 hours comparing Miles Morales to its predecessor. I started nitpicking criticisms that could have easily been applied to the original. There's no better design than just throwing wave after wave of enemy at you after you spend fucking 5 to 10 minutes just doing stealth. I willfully ignored the depth of the characters, I rejected the themes the game was trying to convey. And of all games to do that with, it was Spider-Man Miles Morales, the game about the character who for years was simply compared to Peter Parker, for years tried to shed that shadow and stand on his own 2 feet. Let's just say, the irony wasn't lost on me. To be fair though, I think most people outside of myself loved Miles Morales, but there's a plethora of other cases where this toxic hype culture seeped into pieces of media, most recently with Wandavision. Although Disney's first project in Phase 4 of the MCU released to mostly stellar reviews, it was clear by the end of the show that a lot of people had been disappointed. Not disappointed because the show was necessarily bad, but because so many people, thanks to the power of the internet, had built up wild, fantastical theories about where the show would go. Whether it introduced Mephisto, confirm a multiverse, or introduce Reed Richards and the rest of the Fantastic Four. So when these theories and predictions weren't lived up to, plenty of people felt underwhelmed. Despite the show being a great character-focused story of grief and loss, people wanted more. Now don't get me wrong, I was one of those people. I too had built up expectations that we'd see some shocking revelation, and to be fair, the showrunners without a doubt teased that. But at the end of the day, if I had no knowledge of Marvel, if I'd spent no time theorizing and hyping up my expectations, I probably would have liked the finale of WandaVision a lot more than I did. Cast your mind back to the release of Iron Man, the start of the MCU, a time before Twitter was popular and superhero nerds were even less so. Very few people went into Iron Man with some grand expectation of huge reveals, of teases for future movies. Most people doubted the film would even be good. The end credit scene of that original film was so mind-boggling. The idea of an interconnected universe of heroes was one that had never been explored and had so much potential. But people didn't love Iron Man because it set up future movies, because it cameoed a bunch of recognizable characters. They loved it because it was a heartfelt character study, filled with brilliant performances and a decent chunk of great action. But now, if one of these many MCU films doesn't have multiple end credit scenes and several references to the rest of the universe, then it's considered underwhelming. And that's what hype culture does. It starts by building excitement and expectations, but as time goes on, those expectations become monumental, they become unreachable, and they leave people feeling underwhelmed when their expectations aren't lived up to. The same goes for the likes of Arkham Origins, which in itself is a fantastic game, but is constantly compared and contrasted with Asylum and City, and never given a fair chance to stand on its own 2 feet. Whenever Origins is brought up, it's always to be called the black sheep of the franchise, or to be torn down in comparison to the others. But if those 2 original games didn't exist, we'd probably be calling Arkham Origins one of, if not the best superhero game of all time. Success breeds expectations, but as time goes on, those expectations simply get out of control, and lead to a build-up full of excitement and a release full of disappointment.
Across the board, this is one of the most pathetic superhero titles ever released.
The Star Wars sequels, The Dark Knight Rises, The Matrix sequels, The Last of Us Part 2, there's an endless list of examples of people being disappointed not because something's bad, but because it didn't live up to their preconceived expectations. There is without a doubt times where comparison is completely valid and necessary, but it seems to me that instead of comparing to figure out the best of two great products, people all too often simply tear one product down to praise another. And of course, there's some cases where this disappointment is understandable. The original Watch Dogs and its massive downgrades compared to E3, for example, is an area where consumers were clearly misled. And although I think that Watch Dogs itself is pretty good, the anger that was felt around what that game became is completely justified. This also goes for the likes of Cyberpunk 2077, the original No Man's Sky release, even Suicide Squad.
Actually, it's just so huge that you're probably not going to bump into anyone. You can.
I quite like the sound of that,
Right.
if I'm being quite honest.
You can, right? But
This applies tenfold with Cyberpunk, which after its seeming endless delays finally released last year and in effect ruined CD Projekt Red's reputation forever. Not only was the game terribly optimized, but it also blatantly lacked many of the features that were advertised and hinted at during its marketing campaign. Features that would have made Cyberpunk the immersive virtual wonderland that we all expected it to be. This game had been announced 7 years prior, and so the hype around it had a near decade to build and build. And strangely enough, every time a new delay was announced, the game got an enormous amount of free marketing purely from people discussing it on Twitter. CD Projekt Red had built this game up to be the future of open world games, the future of RPGs, so when it wasn't, gamers everywhere were disappointed. But that disappointment was completely justified, since it was the company themselves that built that excitement by essentially lying to their customers. The expectations were built directly from the marketing, not simply from the players' imaginations and theories. Being shown one thing and given another is a fair reason to be annoyed and disappointed, but all too often we simply build this perfect ideal vision in our head, an ideal which in all reality is impossible to actually be made. If we're being honest, this hype culture isn't going anywhere anytime soon. People will always discuss, theorize, and hype up the latest games, movies, and shows that are dropping. But if you're in the same boat as me, if you find yourself constantly disappointed and underwhelmed at the release of products you've hyped up, I ask of you one thing. Temper your expectations. Now, I know that is easier said than done, and oftentimes it can feel like you're missing out on a community of hype. But if you do, it can make the actual experiences so much better. I had next to no expectations for the recently released Snyder Cut. In all honesty, I thought it would be absolutely abysmal. But because of those low expectations, it pleasantly surprised me, and I ended up really enjoying it. Assassin's Creed Valhalla was a game I criticised from the moment it was announced, but again, it pleasantly surprised me after months of doubt and suppressed excitement. I do still think that Spider-Man Miles Morales is slightly disappointing in comparison to its predecessor, but to try and say it was mediocre just because of that was a reactionary take made while I was blinded by inflated expectations and a desperate need to compare, instead of just appreciating what it was. It is without a doubt a great game and a brilliant Spider-Man story, and my willful ignorance of that was spawned purely from my own self-inflicted hype. Criticism and comparison are vital when it comes to any piece of creative work, as is the hype and excitement that comes from a lead up to said work's release. But these things all too often are getting taken too far, thanks to the echo chamber that the likes of Twitter and Reddit provide, thanks to excitement that's built up over years and years, and thanks to a culture that is built to inflate expectations. And I don't know about you, but I would much rather enjoy and appreciate a game, movie, or TV show for what it is than hate it for what it could be. But that is just my opinion, and maybe you have a completely different opinion, so if you do, let me know in the comments down below, or just let me know that you enjoyed the video if you did. Also, if you did, make sure to hit like, it really does help out the channel and it's really appreciated. And if you want to see more content like this, make sure to subscribe and, hit the bell. You know what the bell is. The notification bell, it's right next to the... Hit the bell. You know what the bell is, you're on YouTube. Also, if you want to support the channel, my Patreon link is in the description, along with my Twitch link. I've started streaming on Twitch, so if you want to see some of the streams, head over there, hit follow, and check it out. Bits of gaming being done over there, so yeah, it's a good time. With all that being said though, thank you again for watching. I've been Joe, aka founder Scarab, and I will see you in the next one. That's just a... What? What now? Excuse me, what the fuck just happened? What? Yeah, Nate just pulled out the AK and just... Oh man. Sully's revolver is alpha as fuck. I'd imagine that's an allegory for his massive meaty cock.